Hello everyone. Please tell me, which city are you listening from? What time is it there? It was just another evening. The kind where the city seemed to fade into the background, the noise of traffic and distant chatter blending into an indistinct hum. I'd walked this street 1,000 times, the same route I'd taken home after work for years. The buildings loomed on either side, some old and crumbling, others newly renovated with their pristine facades. The streetlights flickered faintly, casting pools of pale yellow light on the cracked sidewalk beneath my feet. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wet pavement from the brief rain earlier. But otherwise, it was a quiet, uneventful evening. I wasn't in any particular rush. My mind wandered, as it often did during these walks. The streets were familiar, comforting even. Yet tonight, as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was subtly off. At first, I thought it was just the weariness from the workday, but it was more than that. The street felt different. The familiar rhythm of my steps seemed to echo louder than usual, and the shadows seemed darker, deeper than they should be. I rounded the corner as I always did, and for a moment, I paused. The street ahead was normal just as it should have been, the same rows of houses, the same parked cars along the curb, but something in my gut tightened, a slow, creeping unease that made my pulse quicken. The longer I looked down the street, the more something didn't feel right. The buildings were too close, too still. The world around me seemed quieter. Somehow I took a deep breath and tried to shake the feeling. I kept walking, my footsteps steady, until I reached the end of the block, the point where the street usually curved around to the main road. But tonight, when I reached the end, I stopped dead in my tracks. The street was blocked, not by construction, not by some random obstruction, but by something that didn't belong. The familiar bend in the street was gone, replaced by a high brick wall. The wall was old, its surface cracked and weathered, but it wasn't there yesterday. It wasn't supposed to be there at all. The street should have continued, should have opened up to the next block, but instead, the end was solid and I stepped back, feeling the tightness in my chest grow. I hadn't been drinking, hadn't taken anything that could cloud my mind. I turned around, trying to retrace my steps, but the street behind me didn't look the same either. The houses, the trees, the signs, they were all there, but they seemed slightly off. The angle of the buildings felt wrong, the shadows too thick in places. I turned back toward the wall, hoping that somehow my mind had just tricked me, that the street had always ended here and I simply hadn't noticed. But no, the wall was new, and I could feel it, feel the impossibility of it. I stepped forward again, trying to make sense of it, but as my fingers brushed the rough surface of the bricks, a sudden chill ran up my spine. I pulled my hand away, but the air around me felt colder. The street, the very space I had walked down every day for years, had changed. It wasn't the same street anymore. I walked to the left, trying to go around the wall, but the alleyway I expected to find was gone. Instead, there was only more wall, stretching endlessly in both directions. I turned to the right. Same thing, more wall. The entire street had been swallowed by this barrier. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed up against the wall, staring at it, trying to find a door, a window, anything that could explain this. But there was nothing, just bricks. I felt a cold sweat on the back of my neck, the hairs on my arms standing up as I stood there, trapped in the silence. I tried to calm myself, to think rationally. Perhaps I had taken the wrong turn. Maybe I had gotten lost in the maze of streets and alleyways. But when I turned to look behind me, the street was still the same. The buildings were too close, the houses too identical. The place felt wrong, like it was something that wasn't supposed to be here. A sudden noise broke my thoughts, a distant, echoing sound, a footstep. I turned around sharply, my breath catching in my throat, but there was nothing, just the empty street. The wall and me. The air had grown heavy, thick with an unsettling silence that pressed against my chest. I wanted to leave, wanted to run, but I didn't know where to go. There was no way forward, no way back. The sound came again. This time it was closer. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. I froze, my heart racing in my chest as I glanced around, trying to find the source. But there was no one in sight. The street remained empty, the wall looming ahead, a barrier between me and everything I knew. I looked up, and for the briefest moment, I saw it. The streetlight at the corner, once flickering gently, was now casting a harsh, jagged shadow. The street didn't look the same anymore. The buildings behind me seemed to bend inward, stretching toward the wall like they were closing in on me. The air grew colder still, and the sound of footsteps became clearer, more distinct, and now unmistakable. I wasn't alone. Someone was walking toward me. I spun around, but there was no one behind me. No figure in the shadows, no shape that could explain the sound. Yet the footsteps kept coming, getting closer, growing louder. I looked down at my feet, my breath coming in shallow gasps, trying to steady myself, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, stuck in place, as the echo of the footsteps surrounded me. Finally, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the feeling of being watched, of something lurking, just beyond the reach of my vision. My mind raced as I turned back toward the wall, hoping for some sign of escape, but there was nothing. No door, no path, no way forward. And then, slowly, the wall in front of me seemed to shift. It wasn't a sudden movement, just a subtle, almost imperceptible change. The bricks cracked, and for a moment, I thought I saw something behind them, a shadow, a flicker of movement, like something was trying to break through. I stepped back, my heart pounding, as the space between the bricks seemed to widen just slightly, just enough for a sliver of light to pierce through. I didn't wait to see what it was. The urge to escape overwhelmed me, and I turned to run, but the footsteps were back, closer now, right behind me. I ran down the street, my legs heavy, my breath ragged, but the street kept stretching, and no matter how far I ran, it always seemed the same. The walls loomed closer, the buildings closing in, as though the whole world was collapsing around me. Finally, I stopped, gasping for air, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps had stopped too. The street was silent, the world still. But when I turned to look at the wall again, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A door. It was barely visible, hidden in the shadows at the far end of the street. I didn't think, I ran toward it, my fingers fumbling for the handle. And when I pushed it open, I stepped into darkness. The coldness wrapped around me as I crossed the threshold, the world behind me fading, I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. The oppressive weight of the silence, the endless street stretching in front of me, had disappeared. The door shut behind me, and the world I had known was gone. I didn't know what had happened to the street, or how I had found myself here. But I knew one thing with terrible certainty. I had walked down the same street, and now it was a dead end. There was no way back. The evening had settled in quietly, the kind of dusk that made the world feel smaller, as if the shadows were encroaching on the corners of reality. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint smell of wood smoke from a nearby fire. I had been walking for hours, lost in thought, letting my feet guide me through the familiar streets of the city. I had always found comfort in this quiet time when the bustle of the day faded and the streets seemed to belong only to me. There was something peaceful in the solitude, in the rhythm of my own footsteps echoing off the pavement. I had wandered deeper into a part of the city I didn't frequent often. The streets here were narrow, the buildings old, their stone facades cracked and worn. The streetlights flickered faintly, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground like dark fingers. It wasn't an area that felt particularly dangerous, more forgotten, abandoned by time. It was the kind of place where nothing new happened, where nothing ever seemed to change. I paused in front of an old building, its windows covered in grime, the door heavy with age. It had once been a shop, a small family business. Perhaps the faded sign above the door was barely legible now, but I could make out the faint outline of letters long since worn away by time. I felt the faintest pull to it, an odd sensation that made me step closer, as if the building itself had called me forward. I wasn't sure why I lingered. It was a strange impulse, one I couldn't explain. But something about the place drew me in. I leaned against the crumbling brick wall, peering through the grime-covered window, but all I could see was darkness. The inside of the shop was as empty as the street, silent, forgotten. As I stood there, I saw her. She was standing a few feet away, her back to me. I hadn't heard her approach, hadn't seen her before. She was a woman, tall, with long dark hair, and her clothes were simple, nothing remarkable about her. But there was something unsettling about the way she stood there. She wasn't looking at me or anyone else. She just stood there, as still as the building around her. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should say something, but there was a strange feeling in the air, something that made me pause. It was as if she didn't belong in the world around her, as if she were out of place. The longer I stood there, watching her, the more I felt the sensation that she was somehow part of the shadows themselves, as though she had materialized from the very darkness that surrounded her. And then, without warning, she took a step forward, right into the wall. I blinked, sure that my eyes had played a trick on me. But no, she had walked straight into the brick wall, her figure slipping through it like it wasn't there at all, like the stone was nothing but air. It was impossible. I rubbed my eyes, trying to make sense of what I had seen, but when I looked again, she was gone. There was nothing but the dull, cold surface of the wall. My heart was pounding in my chest now, and I took a step back, unsure of what to think. I hadn't imagined it. I couldn't have. I'd seen her, I had watched her move, and then she had simply disappeared into the wall. I moved closer, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch the place where she had vanished. My fingers brushed against the cold stone, and I felt the slight give of it, as though the wall wasn't quite solid. But no, it was just stone. Just an ordinary, crumbling wall. The world felt off, like I was caught between reality and something else, something I couldn't see. I stepped back, my mind racing. She had walked through the wall. There was no explanation for it, no physical law that could account for what I had just witnessed. But the longer I stood there, the more the sensation of her presence lingered in the air, as if she hadn't really gone at all. I turned quickly and walked away, my steps quickening as I tried to push the image of her from my mind. But no matter how fast I walked, I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something was wrong. I turned corners, trying to lose myself in the maze of streets, but every turn seemed to bring me back to the same place. The street, the buildings, everything felt familiar, yet wrong, like I was walking in a dream that I couldn't wake from. And then I saw her again. This time, she was standing on the corner ahead, her back still to me, motionless. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. How had she gotten there? How could she have? She didn't turn when I approached, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. She simply stood there, her hands at her sides, her posture stiff and unnatural, as if she had been waiting for me. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to call out to her, to ask her what was going on, but the words wouldn't come. There was something suffocating in the air, something that made my throat tighten, made every instinct in me scream to turn away, to leave. But my feet were rooted to the spot, as if some unseen force were holding me in place. She took a step forward, and this time, I couldn't look away. I was frozen, my body unwilling to move. She walked toward me slowly, deliberately, as if there was no rush, as though she knew I wouldn't try to escape. And then she did it again. She walked straight into the brick wall. Just as before, she slipped through it like it wasn't even there. I could see her figure, faintly, on the other side of the wall, as though the space between us had disappeared entirely. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. It was impossible. But then, as I stood there, staring at the place where she had vanished, I realized something. I wasn't alone. I could feel her. I didn't know how, but she was there, somewhere, watching me. And in that moment, I knew one thing. I was never going to leave this street. I was stuck, trapped in a place where reality bent and broke, where walls weren't walls, and people weren't people. I turned back to the wall, my pulse racing, and as I stepped closer, the world around me seemed to shift. The shadows stretched longer, darker, and I knew that I had been here before. I had always been here. I placed my hand against the wall, and for a moment, I thought I felt something soft, something cold, as though the wall itself were breathing. The air around me seemed to change, and when I pulled my hand away, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the stone, was a faint outliner handprint, pressed into the wall. My handprint, as if I had left my mark there without knowing it, without meaning to. But this wasn't the first time I had seen it. No, this handprint, these walls, this street, they weren't new to me. I had been here before, and I would be here again. It was supposed to be just another normal day. A routine I had grown so used to that it barely registered in my mind anymore. I had been working late in the office, as I often did, trying to catch up on some tasks that had piled up over the past few weeks. I had finished my work and decided to call it a day, eager to leave the empty office behind and head home. The building was nearly silent, the lights flickering softly above me as I made my way to the elevator. I pressed the button, and the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. The elevator was empty, just like it always was at this hour. I stepped in, pressing the button for the ground floor, the soft hum of the machine starting up as the doors closed behind me. I leaned against the wall, watching the numbers above the door flicker as the elevator began its descent. But then, something strange happened. As we passed the 9th floor, the elevator jolted. It wasn't a sharp, violent movement, but it was enough to make me take notice. I frowned, feeling the usual sense of discomfort that comes with an unexpected glitch in a machine, but I didn't think much of it at first. The building was old, and the elevator had been having some issues recently, but it was nothing I couldn't handle. I looked up at the numbers again. Instead of continuing to count down as it normally would, the elevator's lights flickered and paused on the 13th floor. I froze. I hadn't pressed any other buttons, so why had it stopped there? The 13th floor, an unlucky number in many cultures, a floor that was never listed in the building directory. It was an odd quirk of the building that, for some reason, the 13th floor didn't exist on the list of floors that tenants had access to. I had never given it much thought before, but now it seemed strange. I shifted nervously on my feet, my heart beginning to race. The 13th floor wasn't supposed to be accessible. It wasn't supposed to exist in this building at all. Hesitated, then glanced at the panel to see if the elevator had malfunctioned. The button for the 13th floor was lit up, but it hadn't been pressed. I hadn't chosen the 13th floor. I never would. The elevator had chosen it for me. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I instinctively reached for the button to descend, to return to the safety of the ground floor. But as I pressed it, the elevator didn't respond. The numbers above the door remained fixed on 13, as if mocking me, as if the building itself was somehow aware of my unease. I looked around, but the interior of the elevator was the same as always. It smelled faintly of stale air, and the soft hum of the machinery was the only sound in the small space. But the longer I stood there, the more the silence seemed to press in on me, growing thicker, more suffocating. The elevator was still, and I could feel the weight of something unseen pressing against me. A quiet tension that I couldn't explain. My breath came faster now, my palms sweating against the cold metal railing. I glanced nervously at the small mirror across from me, half expecting to see something out of place, some distortion in the reflection, but there was nothing. It was just me, standing in the elevator, and the walls surrounding me. Then, the doors opened. I hadn't pressed the button, and yet the doors slid open with a soft, metallic groan. I froze again, unable to move. The hallway outside was dark, shrouded in shadows, and I couldn't see what lay beyond the door. The air felt different now, thicker, colder, and it made my skin crawl. I leaned closer to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The elevator hadn't moved. It hadn't gone anywhere, but the door had opened, revealing a hallway that should not have been there, a hallway that didn't exist. I stepped out cautiously, the quiet hum of the elevator still in my ears, and immediately the air seemed heavier, suffocating. The hallway stretched out before me, lined with flickering fluorescent lights that cast long, harsh shadows. The walls were stained, the paint peeling in places, and the floor was covered in an old, faded carpet that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. The entire place had the feeling of something forgotten, abandoned long ago, sealed off from the rest of the building. I turned back to the elevator, but the doors had closed behind me, leaving me standing alone in the hallway. The elevator was gone, and I was left in a place that shouldn't have existed. My breath quickened, and I felt the unmistakable weight of panic rising in my chest. I didn't belong here. I shouldn't have come out here. The 13th floor wasn't real. It wasn't supposed to be real. The hallway ahead of me was dim, but I could see faint outlines of doors, some ajar, others closed. The sense of unease deepened with each step I took. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like something was watching me, waiting for me to move closer, to explore the unknown. I glanced at the doors, but none of them seemed familiar. None of them seemed right. They were just doors. I kept walking, unable to stop myself, drawn forward by an unknown force. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the air grew colder with each passing step. A low hum filled the space now, not from the elevator, but from somewhere deeper within the building. It vibrated in my bones, a low, unceasing noise that seemed to pull me toward something I didn't want to find. At the end of the hallway, I saw a door. It was different from the other staller, older, and far more ornate, with brass handles that gleamed in the dim light. I hesitated, a wave of dread washing over me, but I couldn't turn back. I felt like I had no choice. I reached out and grabbed the handle, my fingers cold against the metal. The door creaked as I opened it, revealing a room that was almost completely dark, save for the faint outline of furniture that I couldn't make out. The air in the room was thick, heavy with dust, and something else, something metallic, like blood. I stepped inside, my heart racing. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash, and the darkness pressed in on all sides, choking the life out of the air. I reached out, my hands trembling, trying to find something, anything, to ground myself, but there was nothing. And then I heard it. A voice, low and rasping, whispering my name from somewhere in the room. My name, but not my voice. It was the voice of someone I had never met, someone who knew me, knew everything about me. The voice echoed in the darkness, growing louder, closer. I tried to turn and run, but the room seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls closing in around me. I couldn't see where I was going, couldn't tell what was real anymore. I reached for the door, but it was gone. The room had swallowed it, swallowed me whole, and I realized, with a sickening jolt, that I was never meant to leave. It started as a simple walk, one of those aimless meanderings you take when you need to clear your head. The city had been busy, the kind of bustling energy that never really lets you be alone with your thoughts. So I decided to walk no real destination in mind, just a need to feel the streets beneath my feet, to let the rhythm of the world around me distract me from the weight of the week. I hadn't planned on going anywhere specific, but as I turned a corner and walked down a street I didn't recognize, I felt an odd sense of curiosity tugging at me. The street was narrow, lined with tall buildings that seemed to block out the sky above. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. But the air still held a summer warmth that made the evening feel heavy. At first I didn't think much of it. There are always parts of the city that seem to be hidden, tucked away behind the familiar streets I've walked down 100 times. But this street was different. It felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. The buildings here weren't quite like the ones in the rest of the city, old, worn-down brick facades, but there was something about the way they leaned into each other. Their windows dark, that made the place feel abandoned, forgotten. I checked my phone, half expecting to see the usual map pop up showing me my location, but there was no signal. The little bar at the top of the screen flickered and disappeared, entirely leaving only the spinning wheel of no connection. I frowned, tapping the screen, but there was nothing. It wasn't the first time I'd lost connection in the city, but something about it felt different this time, almost like the street itself was blocking me from reaching out to the outside world. I kept walking, hoping to reach a corner where I could get my bearings, but the street stretched on, winding in a way that didn't feel natural. The buildings were getting closer together now, narrowing the street, until I felt like I was walking through a tunnel. It was quiet here, too quiet. The usual sounds of the city, distant car horns, voices from far away were gone. The only sound was the faint tap of my shoes against the pavement, echoing off the walls. At some point, I realized that I hadn't passed another soul since I had turned onto this street. New pedestrians, new cars, just the stillness of the buildings surrounding me. I turned around, expecting to see the corner I'd come from, but the street behind me was no longer the same. It had changed, grown darker, more oppressive. The once familiar skyline was now distorted. The buildings hunched over like watching sentinels, their windows empty and staring. I stopped walking, suddenly uneasy. I had to have taken a wrong turn, or maybe I'd wandered into a part of the city I didn't know. I pulled up the map on my phone again, but the spinning wheel still persisted, mocking me with its endless search for a signal. I tried to remember the landmarks I had passed, but I couldn't. Nothing felt right anymore. This street wasn't on the map. It wasn't supposed to be here. The more I looked around, the more it felt like the world was folding in on itself. The street seemed to stretch on forever, and no matter which direction I turned, there was only more of the same narrow buildings, dark windows, empty space. I felt a creeping sense of isolation, like I was being pulled deeper into a place that didn't belong to the city, a place that didn't belong to the world. I walked on, though I wasn't sure why anymore. My feet moved of their own accord, as though the street was guiding me somewhere, or perhaps I was just trying to find an exit, some way out of this place that didn't exist. But it wasn't until I came to the end of the street, if you could call it that, I truly felt the weight of what was happening. There was no more road ahead. Instead, the street simply ended. But it didn't end like any ordinary street. It ended in a thick fog, a swirling mist that obscured everything beyond it. The fog was dense, almost unnatural, like a wall of smoke that pressed against the buildings. It didn't move, it didn't dissipate. It just was a barrier that separated me from whatever lay on the other side. I stood there, staring into the mist, my heart pounding in my chest. The world felt like it was collapsing inward, like I was trapped in a dream I couldn't wake up from. I took a hesitant step toward the fog, my mind racing with the possibility of what lay beyond it. Was this some kind of illusion? Was it some trick of the mind, a strange glitch in the city's fabric? But when I reached the fog, something unexpected happened. My hand didn't pass through it. It didn't feel like fog at all. Instead, it was solid, like a wall of something dense and cold. I pulled my hand back, my breath quickening, and I looked around for any sign of escape, but there was nothing. No one. Just the wall of mist and the streets that had grown more and more unfamiliar as I had walked down them. I turned around, but the street was gone. The buildings, the sidewalks, the whole landscape, everything had shifted. The street I had walked down wasn't the same anymore. The place where I had come from, where I thought I had entered the street, was now a solid wall of brick, just like the one in front of me. The doors were closed, the windows dark. It was as though the street had never existed in the first place. I ran in the direction I had come from, but every turn I took only led me deeper into the fog, deeper into the twisting alleyways that weren't there before. My legs ached, my heart pounded against my chest, but I couldn't escape. Every corner I turned was the same. The buildings leaned in, closing off the world around me. And then, when I thought I couldn't run anymore, I saw it. At the end of the street, there was a sign. I hadn't noticed it before. It was small, worn, barely visible in the fog, but I could make out the letters, faded but distinct. Do not enter. The words burned themselves into my mind. I reached for my phone again, desperate to call someone, anyone. But the screen was blank. There was no signal. There was no connection to the world I knew. I didn't understand. I couldn't understand what was happening, why this street didn't exist, why it wasn't on the map, why I couldn't leave. I pressed my back against one of the buildings, trying to steady myself, trying to breathe, but the mist thickened around me. It pressed in, suffocating, until the air felt like it was closing over me. And then, in the distance, I heard it. Footsteps. Someone was walking toward me, but when I looked up, no one was there. The sound of the footsteps was growing louder, closer, but the street remained empty. I looked around again, the fog surrounding me now, the world shrinking around me. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the fog began to clear, revealing a door. I knew I had to open it. It was the only way forward, the only escape from this place that didn't exist. I reached out, trembling, my hand barely able to grasp the handle. The door creaked as I pulled it open, and on the other side, there was nothing but darkness. And then, the door slammed shut behind me. It started on an ordinary evening, a walk through the city to clear my mind. I had no particular destination, no rush, just a quiet, solitary walk after a long day. The streets were dim, the only light coming from the streetlights above and the occasional passing car. I had always found something calming about walking at night, the quiet of the streets, the world slowing down, giving me a moment to breathe and think. I started down the familiar path, the one that took me through the quieter parts of the neighborhood. The buildings here were old, their stone facades worn by time, with narrow sidewalks bordered by overgrown trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. There were fewer people around this time of night, and the usual hum of traffic had softened into the background. As I walked, I passed under the first streetlight. It flickered as I approached, casting an uneven glow on the pavement. I slowed for a moment, watching it sway slightly in the wind. I didn't think much of it at first. Streetlights flickering wasn't uncommon, especially in older parts of the city. But as I passed directly beneath it, the light went out, just like that gun. 1 second it was there, and the next it was swallowed by darkness. I stopped, turning around to look back at the now dark streetlight. The faint buzzing sound that had accompanied it was gone, and the world around me seemed just a little colder, a little emptier. I could hear the distant hum of traffic, but it felt muffled, as though the street had become more isolated. I thought it was strange, but not enough to worry about. Maybe it was just a malfunction. Streetlights go out all the time. I kept walking, shaking off the discomfort that lingered. I passed the next streetlight, its glow steady, warm, and welcoming. But as I walked beneath it, the same thing happened. The light flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging me into darkness. I stopped again, feeling a strange unease settle in the pit of my stomach. I didn't want to turn around, didn't want to look back at the darkened light, but I couldn't help it. The street behind me was swallowed in shadow, and I was left standing in the dim circle of the light ahead of me. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just an odd coincidence. The farther I walked, the stranger it became. Each time I walked under a streetlight, it went out. One by one, they blinked off, leaving me in darkness for a few steps, only to be replaced by the faint glow of the next one. But it was always the same. Every light I walked under flickered out when I passed beneath it. I quickened my pace, feeling a coldness settle in the air, a sharpness that wasn't there before. The wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of rustling leaves, but it only deepened the silence around me. The lights ahead seemed to flicker, then go out, one after the other. There was no reason for it, no explanation. The pattern was unmistakable, and the more I walked, the more unnerving it became. Every time I approached the next light, I braced myself for it to go dark. At some point, I realized I wasn't just walking now, I was running. My feet carried me forward without thinking. The lights were going out faster now, faster than they had before. Each step I took, the light behind me would vanish, swallowed by the darkness. The further I walked, the more empty the street felt, the more isolated I became. The world seemed to have become smaller, just the faint circle of light around me, and the dark shadows ahead. I didn't dare look back anymore. I didn't want to see how far behind the darkness had spread. I pushed myself faster, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath quickening. I reached the next streetlight, the glow flickering faintly as I neared it. I closed my eyes for a moment, half expecting it to stay on, to break the pattern. But when I opened my eyes, it was gone, just like the others. I stopped. I stood still in the dark, the silence surrounding me like a thick fog. The last streetlight had vanished, and I was left standing in the middle of an empty street, the world around me completely dark. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The lights shouldn't have gone out. They couldn't have. I tried to convince myself it was some sort of glitch, something natural, but deep down I knew it wasn't. It felt deliberate. It felt like something was waiting for me to notice. I began walking again, slowly now, each step feeling heavier than the last. But the lights didn't come back. The street ahead of me remained in darkness. My footsteps echoed in the quiet, the only sound in the stillness. As I walked, I felt a strange sensation at the back of my mind, a prickling awareness that I wasn't alone. I wasn't just being watched, I was being followed. I turned quickly, looking behind me, but there was nothing. Only the shadows, stretching longer as the minutes passed. I tried to reassure myself, to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling didn't go away. It grew stronger, colder. My pulse quickened again as I turned to face forward, unwilling to look back for fear of seeing something I couldn't explain. And then, just as I reached the next intersection, I saw it. The streetlight ahead flickered, once, twice, then stayed on. For a brief moment, I felt a rush of relief. The light was back. But when I stepped into its glow, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. The shadows didn't match the light. They were too long, too dark, stretching out unnaturally across the pavement. They seemed to move, almost as if they had a mind of their own. I blinked, and the streetlights ahead began to flicker again, each one by one, as if they were signaling something. I took a step forward, my eyes fixed on the next one, my heart pounding louder with each movement I made. And then, it happened. The shadows around me shifted, stretched, and a shape something not quite human emerged from the darkness, moving swiftly toward me. My blood ran cold, and in that instant, I knew I wasn't alone. Whatever had been following me in the dark wasn't just in my mind, it was real. The shape grew clearer with every step it took. A figure tall, cloaked, with hollow eyes that seemed to burn into my soul. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure reached the light, but it didn't cast a shadow. It was as though it existed outside of the light's reach, a presence that could not be touched by the normal world. It stopped in front of me, its face just inches from mine, its eyes empty, its mouth unmoving. I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. The figure just stood there, staring, waiting. And then, with a voice that wasn't a voice, a whisper that didn't sound like it was coming from anywhere at all, it said, "You shouldn't have walked this way." The streetlights blinked once more, and everything went black. It had been years since I left the old apartment. I hadn't thought about it much, not after I moved away. It was just another place in a city full of them, another chapter in my life that had come and gone. The city had changed, I had changed. And somehow, the memories of that apartment faded into the background. But every now and then, on quiet nights, when the world felt too still, I would catch myself thinking about it. The way the walls creaked when the wind blew, the faint smell of damp wood that never quite left. It had always felt like a place that didn't quite belong to me, a place that held memories I wasn't sure I wanted to remember. But that evening, as I walked down the familiar streets, I found myself standing in front of it once again. I don't know why I stopped. I wasn't planning to go back, wasn't even sure why I was out walking in the first place. It was just a restless feeling that had carried me here, a pull I couldn't explain. The building loomed ahead, old and weathered, its faded exterior a shadow of the place I remembered. Time had left its mark, that much was clear. The paint had chipped away, the windows were dull and grimy, and the metal gate that once had a welcoming gleam was now rusted and twisted. But even so, it looked familiar. In a way, it looked the same, or at least, it should have. I stepped closer, drawn toward it, a strange curiosity tugging at me. As I approached, I realized that something was off, something that didn't quite fit. The air felt different here, colder somehow, and there was an eerie stillness, a silence, that felt unnatural. The street behind me was busy with the usual evening noise, but here, it was as though the world had forgotten this place. Forgotten it was even there. I reached the front door and paused. The entrance that had once been open, welcoming, now seemed closed off, the door slightly ajar. I hesitated, uncertain if I should enter. My heart was racing in my chest, a sudden unease creeping up my spine. The memories of the apartment, of my time there, began to resurface, faint, distant flashes, like old photographs that I had tucked away in the corners of my mind. But then, something inside me urged me forward. Maybe it was nostalgia, or maybe it was something else, something deeper that I couldn't quite name. I pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges cutting through the silence. The hallway inside was darker than I remembered. The walls, once lined with old wallpaper, were now bare, the peeling remnants of what had once been there barely visible. The air smelled stale, like something that had been locked away for far too long. It was quieter here, almost oppressive in its stillness. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The floors, which had once been creaky but familiar, felt different underfoot, now damp, almost hollow. I walked down the hall, drawn by some unseen force. The lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that danced unnaturally across the walls. The place was dark, the kind of dark that made the air feel thick, suffocating. When I reached my old apartment door, I stopped. The number 3, my apartment number, was still visible on the door, though it was half worn away, the paint chipped and faded. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the handle. I could feel my heart beating faster, a dull pressure in my chest. But I turned the knob anyway, pushing the door open slowly. What I saw inside made my breath catch in my throat. The apartment was in ruins. The walls, which had once been painted in a soft beige, were now cracked and crumbling. The windows were shattered, their broken glass lying in scattered shards on the floor, glittering in the dim light. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the furniture that had once filled the room was gone. All that remained were scattered remnants, broken pieces of wood, torn fabric, the remnants of something that had been abandoned long ago. I stepped inside, my mind racing. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be the apartment I had lived in. I looked around, my gaze moving over the familiar layout, the small kitchen in the corner, the small bedroom at the back, the living room, where I had spent countless evenings alone. But now it was all gone. The walls were crumbling, the ceiling was cracked, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. It was like the apartment had been abandoned for decades, left to rot in some forgotten corner of time. I took another step forward, the sound of my footfalls muffled by the dust. I reached out for the wall, my fingers brushing against the peeling plaster. The texture felt wrong, rough and uneven, as though the building had aged decades in the short time I had been gone. And then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the corner of the room, beneath the broken window, there was a small object. I couldn't see what it was at first, but as I moved closer, I realized it was a picture frame. I bent down, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. The glass was cracked, but the photo inside was still visible. It was a picture of me. I blinked, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The photo was old, taken long before I had left the apartment. It was a picture of me, standing in the living room, smiling, my life before the move. But there was something strange about it. In the photo, I was alone, but in the corner of the frame, there was something else. A shadow, a figure, just barely visible in the background, standing just out of view. I couldn't make out any details, but it was there, and it felt wrong. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt a sense of dread settle over me, a creeping unease that made my hands shake. I turned quickly, my heart racing, and looked around the apartment again. The walls were closing in on me, the air growing thicker with each breath I took. The shadows seemed to move, shifting in the corners, and I could feel them watching me, waiting. The apartment wasn't just abandoned, it was alive, pulsing with some strange energy that I couldn't understand. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I rushed to the door, trying to pull the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled again, harder, but the door was stuck, locked, as though it had been sealed. From the inside, I could hear the faint sound of something shifting behind me, the sound of footsteps, soft and slow. I spun around, but the apartment was empty again. The walls, the broken furniture, the decaying remnants all gone. The room had returned to the way it had been when I first walked in. Empty, hollow, a shell of something that once was, and I was standing in the middle of it, unable to escape. I pushed harder against the door, my heart pounding in my chest. But no matter how much I pulled, it didn't open. I was trapped in a place that no longer existed, in a room that had never been real. And then, in the silence, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer, moving behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. It was an ordinary afternoon, and I was wandering through the city, letting the streets guide me, as I had so many times before. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting its warm golden glow across the sidewalks, and the usual hustle of the city felt muffled, like the world had turned just a little quieter than usual. My mind wasn't particularly preoccupied, just the usual mix of thoughts and distractions. I had no real destination, no pressing errand to run. It was just a walk, a way to clear my head and lose myself in the rhythm of the city. I had passed by this street before, but for some reason, today it felt different. There was something about the corner shop at the end of the block that caught my attention. It wasn't anything remarkable, just an old storefront, its windows slightly fogged, the door a dull wood that looked like it hadn't been polished in years. I had never noticed it before, or if I had, I hadn't given it much thought. But something about it pulled me in. I crossed the street and stood in front of the door, unsure why I felt compelled to enter. The shop didn't have a sign, no bright advertisements or window displays like most other places did. It seemed to be forgotten, tucked away in the corner of the city, hidden in plain sight. Yet I felt drawn to it in a way I couldn't explain. The door creaked when I pushed it open, the familiar smell of old wood and dust greeting me as I stepped inside. The air felt thick in there, like it hadn't been disturbed in a long time. The shelves lined the walls, but they were empty. No products, no signs of anything for sale. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of something I couldn't place, as if the walls themselves were holding a secret. I paused at the threshold, looking around, confused. There was no one behind the counter, no sign of any salespeople, and no obvious inventory. Just empty shelves. The shop looked abandoned almost, but not quite. There was something about it that felt too present, too alive, in an unsettling way. I hesitated. Why would anyone come in here? There was nothing to buy, nothing to look at, and yet I found myself drawn deeper into the shop, my feet carrying me forward as if there was something I was supposed to find. As I walked deeper into the space, I noticed something odd. The shop wasn't empty. There were people here. They were scattered around the room, but none of them were moving. No one was browsing. No one was looking at the empty shelves. They were all standing still, in strange poses, their eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Some were standing near the windows, others near the back of the shop, but they didn't acknowledge my presence. At first I thought they might be mannequins, lifelike but stationary, set up to give the shop some semblance of business. But no, they weren't mannequins, they were real people. I could tell by the faint rise and fall of their chests, the subtle shift of their weight. Yet, no one moved, not an inch. I moved through the store cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the worn carpet beneath me. There was a faint buzzing sound, almost like a radio that had been left on static. It was distracting, uncomfortable. The people in the shop seemed oblivious to me, unaware of my presence, or at least not reacting to it. I stopped in front of one man who was standing stock still, his gaze directed at a spot on the floor. His face was blank, expressionless. His eyes were wide open, but they were fixed, unblinking. I tried to catch his gaze, but it felt like something was pulling my attention away from him, a quiet force that made me look elsewhere. I turned and walked deeper into the shop, past more figures who stood like statues, all eerily still, none acknowledging the presence of the other. It was a surreal sight, like I had stepped into some sort of dream, a place where time had frozen and no one had the will to move. There was a strange heaviness in the air, as though the room was full of an invisible weight, pressing down on my chest. I reached the back of the shop, and as I did, I realized something. None of the people in the shop were facing me. None of them were facing toward the entrance. They were all turned away, directed at empty walls or nothing at all. That's when I felt it. I wasn't alone. I hadn't been alone since I stepped in. The air around me had changed, and I wasn't sure why, but it felt different, heavier. I glanced at the nearest person, a young woman, her face expressionless, her body rigid. She stood frozen, her hands clasped in front of her, staring straight ahead. Her eyes were wide open, but they were blank, almost glazed over, like she was trapped inside a dream she couldn't wake up from. But as I stared at her, I realized something that made my stomach tighten. Her eyes were slowly shifting, not a dramatic movement, but a subtle, creeping motion. They weren't fixed anymore, they were moving. Very slowly, she was looking at me. I took a step back, my heart racing in my chest. But the woman didn't move. She didn't speak. Her eyes were still, but now they were locked on mine, her stare, unblinking and unyielding. And then, I saw it. The person next to her, another man, standing just a few feet away, his eyes began to move too slowly, imperceptibly at first, but it was unmistakable. They were shifting, turning toward me. One by one, all the people in the shop, the ones who had stood motionless since I entered, began to shift. Their heads turned slowly, their eyes moving, following me with an eerie synchronization. No one spoke, no one blinked, but I could feel them watching me now, their gaze pressing into me like 1,000 invisible hands. I felt the urge to leave, to run, to escape this place, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as though the weight of the room, the weight of their eyes, had trapped me in place. The buzzing in the air grew louder, more oppressive. The people were all staring at me now, their eyes blank, unfeeling, but their gaze never wavered. I stumbled backward, my breath quickening, until I hit the wall behind me. I reached out for the door, but when I turned to face it, it was gone. The entrance had vanished, swallowed up by the walls of the shop, leaving me trapped in this place, with these people who couldn't move, who couldn't speak, but who were watching me. I looked around in a panic, searching for an exit, but there was no way out. The door I had entered through was gone, as though it had never been there. I was surrounded by rows of empty shelves, the same still figures, their eyes fixed on me, as though they were waiting for something, waiting for me. I tried to scream, but the sound didn't come. The buzzing sound that had filled the air became deafening, and the walls seemed to close in, inch by inch. The space around me felt smaller, suffocating. My chest tightened with fear, and I could feel the weight of their gaze pressing harder, colder. And then, one of them moved. It was the man who had been closest to me. He stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, his eyes still locked on mine. He didn't say anything, didn't make a sound, but his footsteps echoed through the silence. He didn't stop, he kept coming. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to run. But then, in the midst of the silence, I heard something whisper, a voice that wasn't a voice, but a presence, a feeling. It came from everywhere, and nowhere at once. You should have never come in. The night was quiet, too quiet for my liking. I had taken the same route home countless times before through the narrow alley that cut between the two old buildings. The one that always felt a little too dark, a little too empty. It was a shortcut, one that shaved a few minutes off my walk, and I had never thought twice about it. But tonight, for reasons I couldn't quite explain, something felt off. The shadows in the alley seemed deeper, thicker than usual, and there was a coldness in the air that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I slowed my pace as I stepped into the alley, the faint hum of city life muffled by the towering walls on either side. The ground beneath me was uneven, the cobblestones slick from the evening rain, the faint glow from the streetlights above. Barely reached the center of the alley, leaving the space between the buildings steeped in darkness. I pulled my coat tighter around me, a sudden chill creeping down my spine. It wasn't just the cold, though. There was something about the alley tonight that felt wrong. Something about the way the darkness seemed to cling to the edges of the buildings. The way the air hung heavy, like it was waiting for something. I was halfway through when I heard it. My name, it came from behind me, from the far end of the alley, soft at first, like a whisper. Your name. My breath caught in my throat. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart racing. I couldn't explain it, but a cold wave of dread washed over me. I turned around quickly, half expecting to see someone standing there, someone calling me, but there was no one. The alley was empty, just as it had been moments before. The only sound was the distant hum of the city, the occasional drip of water from the rain. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. It had to be a trick of the wind, I thought. Maybe the echo of someone's voice from farther down the street had carried into the alley, but no. The voice had been too clear, too distinct. Your name. This time, it was louder, closer. I felt the hairs on my neck stand up, the air growing colder still. I glanced around, but the alley remained deserted. There was no one standing at the mouth of it. No shadowed figure waiting, just empty space. I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the unease that was creeping up my spine. The alley felt tighter now, the walls seeming to close in around me. It wasn't just the cold anymore. There was something in the air, a presence that felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be here, like I didn't belong. I started walking again, faster now, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The sound of my shoes on the wet cobblestones oddly loud in the silence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me, watching me. I could feel it, the weight of it pressing down on me. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it again. Your name. This time, the voice was unmistakable. It was close to close. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The alley was still empty. There was no one in sight. No one anywhere. I was alone. But the voice, my name, had come from right behind me. I turned around so quickly that I almost stumbled, but again, there was nothing. No one. The alley was silent once more, save for the sound of my own breathing. Shallow and rapid. I stood there for a moment, the cold air pressing against my skin, my breath misting in the night. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I took a few more steps, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the day had been too long, too exhausting, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe it was nothing. But as I neared the end of the alley, I heard it again. Your name? This time, the voice was closer than it had ever been, right next to me. I felt the breath catch in my throat. I turned, my body moving before my mind could catch up. But there was no one there. Nothing. Just the empty alley, the shadows, the wet cobblestones. I took a step back, my eyes darting around, desperate to find something, anything that could explain the voice. The air felt thick with something I couldn't place, something I couldn't name. It wasn't just the darkness that surrounded me. It was the presence, the feeling of being watched, of being drawn into something I didn't understand. I looked ahead again, and for the briefest moment, I saw a figure at the far end of the alley. It was a shadow, standing still in the darkness, its shape indistinct. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I blinked, the figure was gone. I stood still, my mind racing. I didn't know what I had seen, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't alone. The alley had changed. The world around me felt different, as though the very fabric of reality had shifted. I felt like I was in a dream, or worse, trapped in a nightmare. I turned again, trying to leave the alley, but as I walked, the same unsettling sensation crept up on me. The air felt heavier with each step. The shadows seemed deeper, longer, as though the alley was stretching farther than it should have. I glanced behind me again, but there was nothing. No figure, no voice, just the empty space. And then, just as I was almost at the end of the alley, I heard the voice one final time. Your name. This time, it was right next to me. I froze, my skin prickling with the undeniable sensation that someone was standing beside me, close enough that I could feel the shift in the air, feel the pressure of their presence. My heart raced, my legs frozen, as I stood there, the world around me going still. I didn't dare turn around. And then, the alley shifted. It was subtle at first, just a slight change in the air, but it grew. The walls of the alley seemed to stretch, the shadows lengthening unnaturally. The familiar brick facades that had lined the street were now replaced by a cold, empty void. The alley no longer felt like a place I recognized. It felt like I had stepped into another world, one that wasn't my own. The silence was suffocating, the pressure on my chest unbearable. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move. It was as though I had been pulled into this place against my will. And then, the voice came again, closer than ever. Your name. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Because I knew without a doubt that whatever had been calling me wasn't human. It wasn't a person. It was something far worse. Something that had been waiting for me in the shadows of the alley. Something that wanted me to hear my name over and over again, until I was lost to it. The alley was no longer just a street. It was a trap. And I had walked right into it. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The streets were mostly empty, save for a few late-night wanderers and the occasional car passing by. I had taken this walk 100 times before, down the same familiar path, but tonight something felt different. The usual comfort of my evening routine had been replaced with an unsettling stillness that hung in the air, like a warning I couldn't quite decipher. I was walking down a narrow street that cut through the heart of the city. The buildings on either side loomed tall and close, their windows dark and empty, save for the faint glow of streetlights casting long, jagged shadows. The ground was wet from an earlier rain, and I could hear the soft squelch of my shoes on the pavement as I walked. The sound of my footsteps felt strangely louder than usual, filling the silence around me. I had been walking for a few minutes when I saw her ahead of me. She was walking briskly, a woman in a long coat, her hair dark and flowing behind her as she moved. She didn't seem out of place, just another person on the street, but there was something about the way she moved that caught my attention. She walked with purpose, her steps steady, her posture straight, as though she had somewhere to be. At first, I thought nothing of it, but as I continued walking, I noticed something strange. She didn't turn around, she didn't glance over her shoulder, and she didn't look at me as I drew closer. It was as if she didn't know I was there at all, or perhaps as though she couldn't hear the soft sound of my steps behind her. The more I walked, the more I felt that there was something wrong about her, something off. It wasn't her appearance, it was the way she walked, the way her movements were so deliberate, so controlled, as though she were being guided by something I couldn't see. I quickened my pace, curiosity pulling me forward. I wasn't sure why, but something about her made me want to see her face. to understand why she seemed so familiar, but not in the way one would recognize a person. It was more like an echo, a shadow of something just beyond reach. As I neared her, I noticed something else. Her footsteps didn't match mine. They weren't in sync with the rhythm of the street. The sound of her shoes hitting the wet pavement seemed off. It wasn't just that they were quieter. They didn't seem to make the same mark on the ground as mine did. I looked down at the wet street beneath my feet, and that's when I saw it. Her footprints had stopped. I stopped too, my heart suddenly racing. I stood still, staring at the ground in front of me. Her footprints were there, clear and distinct in the wet pavement. But they didn't continue. She had stopped walking. The trail of her steps ended abruptly, just a few feet ahead, with no sign of where she had gone. I glanced up, but she was still walking ahead, her back to me, as though she hadn't noticed anything. Her steps didn't change in speed, nor did they falter. It was as though she was walking on air, her feet leaving no trace behind her. I took another step forward, then another, my shoes now silent against the pavement. But no matter how close I got, her footprints remained frozen in place. I called out, my voice trembling in the silence, "Hey, excuse me." She didn't respond. I stood there, the words hanging in the air between us, unanswered. Something in the pit of my stomach twisted, a cold sensation that crawled up my spine. I wanted to walk away, to turn around and go back, to forget what I had seen, but I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the spot, my eyes glued to her form ahead, and something deep inside me urged me forward, to keep moving toward her, to find out what was happening. I started walking again, my steps slower now, my breath shallow. With each step I took, I felt the tension building in my chest, a growing knot that made it harder to breathe. As I neared her, I saw her more clearly, her dark coat, the way her hair swayed as she moved, the faintest trace of a shadow hanging just behind her. And then, just as I was within arm's reach of her, something impossible happened. Her footsteps started again, but they were backwards. I froze, my mind racing to comprehend what I was seeing. Her feet were moving in reverse, her steps retracing the path she had just taken. The sound of her shoes against the wet pavement was a faint, eerie echo in the quiet street. Her footprints, which had been left behind on the ground, were now being erased, one step at a time, as though she were undoing her own presence. I stood there, paralyzed, watching as the footprints vanished under her, the pavement now empty and smooth. The woman kept walking, moving backward, and the further she went, the more the ground beneath her seemed to return to its original state. There was no trace of her left behind, no mark of where she had been. The sound of her footsteps grew quieter, fainter, and then, just as I was about to move, they stopped altogether. She had disappeared. I blinked, disoriented, unsure of what had just happened. The street was still quiet, the faint light of the streetlights casting long shadows down the alley. I looked around in confusion, my heart pounding, but she was gone. No footsteps, no figure, no nothing. I turned in every direction, looking for her, hoping for some explanation, some sign that I wasn't losing my mind, but there was nothing. The street was empty. The world felt too still. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but as I did, I realized something else. I couldn't remember how I had gotten here. The intersection, the street, the path I had been walking, It all felt wrong now, unfamiliar. The more I tried to recall the steps that had brought me here, the more distant the memory became. The walk I had taken earlier, the quiet street. The woman, everything felt like a dream, like something that didn't belong to me. The coldness crept deeper, wrapping around me, making it hard to think clearly. I turned to go back, but the street felt longer now. The buildings loomed over me, casting deeper shadows, and as I walked, I realized I had no idea where I was anymore. The familiar street had shifted, distorted. The alley that had once felt like a simple shortcut now felt like a maze, a labyrinth that had no end. And that's when I heard it again, your name. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The voice was faint, distant, but unmistakable. It wasn't the same as before this time. It was more like a whisper, a faint echo of something that had been left behind. I turned toward the voice, but there was no one. The alley was empty, the streetlights flickering in the distance, casting long, stretching shadows. But I knew, in the deepest part of my gut, that I wasn't alone. I could feel the presence of something watching me, something following me, even though I couldn't see it. I started walking faster, my feet stumbling over the uneven pavement, my pulse racing in my chest. The shadows around me seemed to grow deeper, stretching toward me, pulling at me. And I knew that no matter how fast I ran, the path would never end. I was being followed, but not by her, by something worse. The evening was unusually warm for this time of year, the kind of night where the air feels thick, heavy, and still. I had been walking for what felt like hours, not going anywhere in particular, just letting my feet guide me. I had needed to clear my head, to escape the confines of my apartment, where everything felt like it was closing in. The city had that strange, quiet calm that often settles after a long day, the streetlights casting soft pools of light on the pavement, the distant hum of cars, and the occasional sound of someone walking by. It wasn't busy, not like during the day, but it wasn't silent either. I didn't plan to walk down this street. I had taken it by accident, a side street I didn't recognize, one that veered off from the usual path I'd take home. The houses here were old, some looking like they'd been abandoned for years. Others well kept, but shrouded in thick ivy, as though they were trying to hide from the world. The sidewalk under my feet was cracked and uneven, the pavement worn with age. It was as if time had forgotten this street, left it behind. And yet, despite the eerie quiet, there was something strangely compelling about it. As I walked further down the street, I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The familiar sounds of the city seemed to fade away, replaced by a quiet hum, like the air itself was vibrating. It wasn't a pleasant feeling, more like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though the street was empty, no one else in sight. I was so lost in thought, caught between the unsettling quiet and the faint, oppressive feeling in the air, that I almost didn't notice the crack in the pavement ahead of me. But when I did, I stopped dead in my tracks. It was wide, deep, as though something had ripped through the concrete from below. The crack ran along the edge of the sidewalk, jagged and uneven, as if something had forced its way up from beneath. I knelt down, instinctively reaching out to touch the edges of the crack, my fingers grazing the rough, exposed concrete. It was colder than it should have been, the chill seeping through my fingers and into my skin. I looked down into the dark space the crack had created. It was deep, but I couldn't see anything beyond the first few inches. It was as if the crack led down into an infinite void, a darkness that didn't belong beneath the streets of the city. My heartbeat quickened as I stood there, staring into it, the strange hum growing louder, vibrating in my chest. And then I felt it. A shift in the air. A subtle tremor, like something moving beneath the ground. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat, but I couldn't look away. It wasn't just the sensation of something beneath my feet. It was the way the ground itself seemed to ripple, as though whatever was down there was alive, pulsing, waiting. Suddenly, the crack expanded. It wasn't just the pavement shifting now. The ground itself seemed to split open, wide enough to reveal something dark, slick, and wet beneath. I gasped, stepping back once more, my pulse racing, my mind screaming for me to turn around and leave. But I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the widening crack. And then, something emerged. A hand. It was pale, thin, unnaturally long, its fingers reaching up from the darkness beneath the pavement, stretching toward me with deliberate slowness. I could see the dirt and grime caked beneath the nails, the pale, sickly skin that looked too thin, too fragile to be human. But it wasn't the appearance of the hand that sent a jolt of terror through me, was the movement. The fingers twitched, curling in the air, almost as though it were testing the space above, feeling the air like it was looking for something or someone. I took a step back, but the hand didn't stop. It reached farther, its long fingers curling outward, pressing against the broken pavement, as if to pull itself up from below. I could feel the ground tremble underfoot, as though whatever was down there was pushing its way up, forcing the earth to give way. A low, guttural sound, something between a growl and a hiss, seeped up from the darkness beneath the pavement. It wasn't a sound made by anything human. The vibration of it sent a chill down my spine, and I stumbled back again, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The hand continued to stretch out, its fingers moving toward me with an eerie, deliberate pace. I turned, almost without thinking, and started running. My feet pounded against the cracked sidewalk, my heart pounding in my chest, every step feeling like it was too late. I could hear the sound of the earth behind me shifting, as though whatever was beneath the pavement was still following me, still reaching for me. The hum in the air grew louder, the sound vibrating through my body, filling my ears with a strange, oppressive energy. The alleyway stretched on endlessly in front of me, the shadows growing deeper, the streetlights flickering above me, casting strange, elongated shadows on the walls. The more I ran, the faster the crack seemed to widen, the earth breaking apart beneath me. I turned the corner, hoping to find another way out, but as I did, the street seemed to warp before my eyes. The buildings that should have been there were gone, replaced by dark, oppressive shapes that loomed over me, blocking my path. The street was closing in on me, the space shrinking, the air growing heavier, and then I heard it again. The crack followed me. The sound of something crawling beneath the pavement was now unmistakable, a faint scraping noise growing louder and louder as it approached. I turned and ran down another alley, desperate to escape, but the path before me twisted, warped, like the streets themselves had been swallowed up by the darkness. I looked behind me once more, and for the briefest moment, I saw it. The hand, it wasn't reaching for me anymore. It was pulling itself completely out of the ground, its long fingers curling upward, its arm following, stretching out from the earth beneath me, clawing its way to the surface. I couldn't breathe. My legs buckled, and I stumbled to the ground. The pavement shifting beneath me. The alley around me twisted. The shadows closing in on all sides. The scraping, gnawing sound growing louder. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the ground went still. I sat there for a long moment, gasping for breath, unsure of what had just happened. The air had returned to normal, the sound had stopped, and everything was eerily quiet again. I looked around, my mind still reeling from the surreal experience. The alley was just a normal street again, no cracks, no hands, no darkness beneath my feet. But something had changed. The street was empty, quiet, still. But in the back of my mind, I could feel it. Something had reached up from below. Something that hadn't been there before. Something that wasn't meant to be. And it was waiting. Waiting for the next time I walked down this street. The evening was quiet. The kind of stillness that settles over the world when the sun dips below the horizon and the city seems to exhale, resting in the soft embrace of twilight. I was coming home after a long day at work, the familiar walk. From the subway to my apartment, the same routine I had followed for months. It was the kind of evening where my mind wandered aimlessly, lost in thought, trying to put the weight of the day behind me. My footsteps echoed down the hallway of my building, the walls too close. The faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead mingling with the distant hum of traffic from the street below. When I reached my door, I noticed something odd. It wasn't the door itself, but the feeling. It was the faintest sensation, like something wasn't quite right. The air felt too still, too heavy. I pushed the thought aside and slid my key into the lock. The door clicked open with its usual, familiar sound. But when I stepped inside, something was different. The apartment was silent, save for the faint whirring of the refrigerator and the soft hum of the city outside. The room was dim, the evening light filtering through the blinds, casting long shadows on the floor. As I walked in, I noticed the slight disarray. The clothes I had left on the couch that morning were gone, and the books I had scattered on the coffee table were neatly stacked. My first thought was that I had left the apartment in a rush that morning and must have cleaned up before I left. But that thought was quickly replaced by a sense of unease. I turned around to lock the door behind me and froze. There, in the doorway, stood a woman. At first, I thought she was a stranger, someone who had somehow gotten into my apartment. But no, she was too still, too perfectly composed, standing in the doorway like a figure from a dream. I blinked, and the world seemed to slow for a moment. The shadows in the hallway deepened as the faint light from the living room cast an eerie glow around her. She didn't move. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, her eyes locked on me, as if waiting for something, as if waiting for me to speak. Her features were blurry at first, almost too vague, like I couldn't focus on her face. But as I looked harder, it became clearer. Her face was pale, her hair dark, falling just past her shoulders. She wore a long, simple dress, one that I didn't recognize. And her expression was unreadable, detached, as though she were waiting for me to do something. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, my throat tight. She didn't respond. She didn't move. Her eyes remained fixed on me, and I felt the weight of her gaze pressing against me like an unseen force. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with a tension that I couldn't explain. I took a step back, instinctively, but something felt wrong. I glanced around the apartment. The space around me seemed off. The furniture was arranged in the same way, but everything felt slightly different. The walls were too close, the shadows in the corners too dark. The room wasn't the same. It was like the layout had shifted, subtly, unnaturally, and it made my skin crawl. I turned back to the doorway, but she hadn't moved. Her presence in the doorway felt like it was pulling the very light from the room, and the shadows grew deeper around her. My pulse quickened. I wasn't sure if it was fear or something else, but I felt the desperate need to get out of that apartment, to leave, to escape whatever this was. I didn't know who she was, but I knew she didn't belong here. She didn't belong in my home. But as I moved toward the door, the sensation of something being wrong intensified. I reached the hallway, and for a brief moment, I glanced behind me. The doorframe the hallway wasn't the same anymore. The apartment wasn't the same anymore. I could feel it. The hallway behind me stretched further than it should have, the walls closing in, the air becoming more oppressive, as though the apartment was expanding in ways it shouldn't be able to. I turned back to look at her, expecting her to still be standing in the doorway, but she wasn't there anymore. I stumbled back, my breath shallow, looking at the now empty doorframe. The apartment was empty, completely empty. I blinked again, my heart hammering in my chest. The walls were bare, the furniture gone, and the space around me was hollow, like the room had never been lived in. My mind reeled, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. I looked at the windows. The view was wrong. It wasn't the familiar sight of the city outside. Instead, there was nothing, just an endless black void, as though the outside world had disappeared completely. I rushed back to the door, my hands shaking as I grabbed the handle, but when I opened it, I saw nothing but darkness. The hallway outside was gone, replaced by a dense fog, thick and suffocating, that seemed to stretch on forever. I slammed the door shut, my heart racing. I turned back around, my hands gripping my head as I tried to make sense of the madness. The room I had known so well was gone. The door frame was still there, but it wasn't the same door. The space wasn't the same. I glanced at the walls, my mind struggling to process what had happened. The apartment seemed to stretch further, now, as if the walls were shifting, bending outward, warping in a way I couldn't understand. The shadows were darker, pulling at me, and I felt a pull, a deep pull, like the room itself was trying to swallow me whole. And then, just as I was about to scream, I saw her again. She wasn't in the doorway this time. She was standing across the room, her form more solid now, more present, as though she had been there the entire time, watching me, waiting for me to see her. Her face was clearer now, her eyes dark pools of silence that reflected something in me, something I couldn't comprehend. She raised a hand, slowly, almost as if in greeting, and I could feel the weight of her presence in every inch of the room, I took a step backward, unable to speak, unable to move. The room now too large, too empty. My mind screamed for answers, screamed to escape, but I was frozen in place. She was closer now, and her gaze never wavered from mine, as though she had been waiting for me to understand. And then, in the deepest corner of my mind, a thought surfaced, one so fleeting and impossible that I almost didn't grasp it at first. This wasn't my apartment anymore. This wasn't even the same room. The door had closed behind me, but I wasn't supposed to be here. And I realized, with a sickening certainty, that she had been waiting for me to see it all along. It was one of those evenings where everything felt normal to normal. The kind of night that should have been uneventful but somehow felt heavier, like the weight of something unseen was pressing against me. The sun had just set, casting a dull orange glow over the streets, and I was walking home from the store, taking the same route I always did. My footsteps echoed softly in the quiet streets, the only sound in a city that seemed to be winding down for the night. I turned the corner onto the usual street, the one that led me home. It was a calm, residential road, lined with old trees and rows of houses with their lights dimmed behind closed windows. The air was cool, the kind that always made me feel like I could breathe just a little easier. The smell of damp earth and the distant hum of city life fading into the background. But tonight, something was different. I couldn't place it, but there was a strange shift in the air, a subtle disturbance in the rhythm of the evening. I slowed down for a moment, noticing how empty the street was. There were no cars, no people. Just me and the slowly fading light. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that made you aware of your own thoughts, your own breath. I was about to continue walking when I saw her. She appeared at the intersection, stepping out from behind the corner of the building as if she had just come into view from nowhere. She was a woman, maybe in her late 20s, dressed in a long coat and a scarf, her dark hair falling loosely around her shoulders. She didn't seem out of place, and yet, something about her made my heart skip a beat. It wasn't her appearance there. Was nothing strange about her, but something in the way she moved, the way she crossed the street. It felt deliberate, like she was moving as though she knew exactly where she was going, even though I hadn't seen her before. She didn't look at me as she walked across the intersection, and I didn't think anything more of it until she reached the other side. And then, without missing a beat, she disappeared. 1 second she was there, walking toward the sidewalk, and the next second, nothing. She vanished as if she had been swallowed up by the night itself, as though she had never existed at all. I blinked, confused, stepping forward to where she had been, looking around, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. There was no sign of her, not even a trace of movement in the empty intersection. The street was silent once again, the only sound the soft rustling of the leaves in the trees. I stood still, my mind racing to process what had just happened. I had seen her clearly. I had seen her walk across the intersection. I knew I wasn't imagining it, but she was gone, just like that. Disappeared without a trace. I didn't know why, but a sudden, irrational urge gripped me to keep walking, to keep going. I tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me, but it lingered, thick and heavy. I walked to the next block, my feet moving faster now, a sense of urgency filling me, and that's when it happened. I turned the corner at the next block, and there she was, again standing on the sidewalk, just ahead of me. My breath caught in my throat. It was the same woman, the same dark coat, the same scarf, the same loose hair. She was standing in the exact same spot, as if she had never moved, as though the moment from before had never happened. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at her. She didn't notice me at first, just stood there, staring ahead at nothing in particular. The same strange feeling washed over me, that sense of something being out of place, of something not quite right. But how could she be here? How could she be standing in front of me, when just moments ago, I had seen her vanish at the intersection? There was no way she could have crossed the street that quickly. It didn't make sense. I took a hesitant step forward, unsure of what to do, my mind struggling to process the impossible situation. She turned then, just slightly, her head tilting toward me as if she had only just noticed me standing there. She didn't smile, she didn't say anything. But there was something in her Isa recognition, maybe, or something deeper. It felt like she was looking into me, through me. I felt my throat tighten, my legs heavy beneath me, as if I had stepped into some sort of trap. She didn't speak, didn't even move, but in that brief moment, everything around me seemed to blur, like the world had become suddenly distant, out of focus. And then, just as suddenly as before, she was gone, disappeared, just like that. I stood in the middle of the street, frozen, my heart racing in my chest. I spun around, my breath coming fast, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She had vanished again, as though she had never been there in the first place. There was no sound, no movement, just the empty street and the fading light. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. My thoughts raced, but I couldn't make sense of it. How could she be in front of me again, after I had just seen her disappear? How could I be so sure of what I had seen, and yet, it felt like it had never happened at all? I needed to get home. I needed to leave this place, to escape whatever was happening. But as I turned to walk back, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the intersection ahead, she was standing there again. This time, her eyes were fixed on me. Her posture was stiff, unnaturally still, and her gaze locked onto mine with an intensity that made my chest tighten. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stared, watching me from the shadows of the streetlights. I could feel her presence pulling at me, tugging at something deep inside me, a pull I couldn't resist. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my feet wouldn't move. My body was frozen, caught in her gaze. I was trapped between the streetlights and the growing shadows, caught in the moment between seeing her and knowing I should never have seen her at all. And then, with a faint whisper that didn't seem to come from her lips, but from the very air around me, I heard her speak. "You're not supposed to see me." The words hit me like a wave, and the ground beneath me seemed to shift as though the world itself was tilting. My heart raced faster, a dizzying pulse that pushed against my chest. And then, she disappeared again.